So hello and welcome to the second episode of the Scottish History Podcast. My name's Owen Innes and I'm going to take you on this journey. If you haven't already listened to part one, I highly suggest that you do so. We are starting off telling the story of the Scottish Wars of Independence. Now, so far I have covered a little bit of Alexander II into Alexander the Third, the death of Alexander III, and finally we left it with the death of Margaret, the Maid of Norway, Alexander's granddaughter. And this has left Scotland in a position where all of its royal monarchy and the royal line has now ended. There is no one else, so we're going to have to look for a new king. As discussed before, it had to be a new king. It could not be a queen. So the choice was always going to be for a king, a man, to take the throne. So immediately following the death of Margaret, two men came forth to state that they were the next claimants to the Scottish throne. One man was called John Balliol and the other man was called Robert Bruce. Now, Robert Bruce is a name which is synonymous with Scotland, of course, Robert the Bruce, but this is not the same man. They are, however, related. This is Robert the Bruce's grandfather. So the Scottish nobility and the Scottish churchmen were going to choose who the next king of Scots was going to be. However, they couldn't do that on their own. They had to have an intermediary. They had to have a middleman, and this middleman was chosen as Edward I of England, the Longshanks. Now, you've probably heard the term Longshanks before. Again, if you're familiar with Braveheart, Longshanks simply means long legs. He was known for having his incredibly long legs, but a rather short body as well. Apparently, a few other kind of birth defects or growth defects, if you will. But that's where the term comes from. Nothing really sinister. It's his title as the Hammer of the Scots that's probably his more recognised title, specifically in Scotland and in England. So he was also known as the Hammer of the Scots. That might give you an idea as to what's about to come in the podcasts following this. So Edward I, he was going to help Scotland choose their new king, so he invited the Scottish nobility down to England. Now it was in Norham Castle, just again over the border between Scotland and England, just the other side of the River Tweed, and the Scottish nobility were refusing to cross over that border, as all Scotland's matters, being an independent country as they were at the time. The decisions in Scotland had to be made in Scotland. However, Edward was not having any of it. Edward wanted this to be sorted out on his own land. He did say, however, Edward, that is, did say that if the Scottish nobility came across and they wanted him to help them, that they would have to declare his overlordship over Scotland. So Edward would be Scotland's overlord. And essentially, if they didn't do this, Edward would bring great wrath onto Scotland. The first of the men to finally agree to cross over the border into England and pledge their allegiance to King Edward was Robert Bruce. The last of the men to do so was John Balliol. Edward had placed another kind of stipulation on all of this. Again, it was Robert Bruce and John Balliol, but Edward had went out and found 11 other claimants to Scotland's throne, and to make it even harder for the Scots. It wasn't just going to be a direct choice between these two men. Edward was going to make it as convoluted and as long a process as possible by introducing these other 11 men. This is what we now refer to as the Great Cause. There was 13 men in total, and again it was whittled down to just two, Bruce and Balliol, and ultimately it was John Balliol that was chosen to become Scotland's new king. Again, this is not what Scotland wanted. Scotland and the people, the nobles, they wanted Robert Bruce. They wanted Robert Bruce because he was more of a warrior king. He was a protector, and John Balliol wasn't. John Balliol was more of a materialistic king. He wanted more to do with the crown, the shiny things, the money, the fame, the medieval fame, I suppose. Whereas Robert Bruce, he was interested in actual protection. He was an experienced knight. So John Balliol is chosen to become Scotland's new king. He's crowned personally by Edward I of England himself at Scone Palace on the Stone of Destiny. And immediately the people of Scotland turn on John Balliol. John Balliol, again, at his coronation, pledges his allegiance to Edward. And very soon after, John Balliol becomes regarded as Tomb Tabard. So that's Tomb Tabard, the empty jacket. It was believed that John Balliol was nothing more than a puppet to Edward. So Edward was calling all the shots and John Balliol was doing nothing at all about it. It is for this reason, and a few other reasons as well, but this main reason why John Balliol is still to this day regarded as the worst king that Scotland has ever had. So much so, to the point that if your name is John and you want to ascend to the Scottish throne, we will make you change your name. John is seen as an unlucky name in royalty terms, and if you don't believe me, go and have a look up as to the real name of King Robert III of Scots. You'll find his real name was John. They made him change his name to the more lucky Robert, following, of course, the successes of Robert I, who was Robert the Bruce. So John Balliol, or Tomb Tabard, really started getting on the nerves of Edward I, because after a while, John Balliol did grow a backbone. He did actually start doing what his people wanted him to do. The first of these was Edward, like John I that we mentioned in the first episode, wanted to go to war with France. And he wanted to take Scotland and the Scottish troops and, of course, John Balliol along with him. John Balliol refused this, however, because John Balliol had land in France. He was friends with the French king. Why would John Balliol want to piss off the French as well? But this turned out to be a big mistake because it ended up pissing off Edward I. So this made Edward I rather unhappy in the first place, but then the second thing was that John Balliol actually physically went to France and signed an alliance with them. So signed an alliance with the French king, and this is known as the Auld Alliance, spelled A-U-L-D. So Auld is just the old Scots word for old. So the Auld Alliance was essentially that kind of classic playground sort of thing. You hit my friend and I'll hit you back. So that was basically what the Auld Alliance was. So the idea was if England were to attack France, then Scotland would attack England, and vice versa. If England were to attack Scotland, then France would attack England. The Auld Alliance, however, did not work in the outset, certainly. And this was because England's army was huge. England's army outnumbered the Scots army ridiculously, but also down in France, they weren't necessarily up for fighting either. So when Edward eventually did invade France and Scotland retaliated, Edward was simply able to just take half of his troops from France, send them up into Scotland, and the problem was essentially eradicated. But of course, with John Balliol and the Scots attacking England, this annoyed Edward even further. So Edward actually followed his invasion troops into Scotland. Their first port of call was the town of Berwick, Berwick upon Tweed as it is now known. So of course with the word Tweed in there, you're going to know that it's near that border. Berwick upon Tweed nowadays is in England, but it was one of those towns that constantly changed during these times between Scottish occupation and English occupation. So at the time, Berwick upon Tweed was actually under Scottish occupation. Edward and his troops, they go into Berwick, they lay siege to Berwick, they sack it over the course of 3 days. Over 90% of the population of Berwick was killed over the course of those 3 days. Rumour circulates, and theories that you can read anywhere do state that Edward himself did stop and did call for an end of the sacking of Berwick after he saw one of his own soldiers killing a pregnant woman who was actually in the process of giving birth at the time. And that was apparently too much for Edward, and he called an end, and that's why it lasted for 3 days. And that's essentially why not everybody was killed. Now, Berwick was a very important town, specifically for trade down to the Netherlands and into Germany and things like that. It's a port town, and technically still is to this day. So so all of the ships, all of the trade for Scotland was essentially cut off now completely from the rest of Europe. But Edward didn't stop at Berwick. They headed further north and right up into the northeast of Scotland to a place called Montrose, or Montrose, depending on how you pronounce it. So that's where they find John Balliol. He's up in Montrose. John Balliol is subsequently arrested. He's stripped of his land. He's stripped of all of his titles. And of course, he's stripped of the crown of Scotland. So John Balliol is no longer to be regarded as the King of Scots, and he's placed in prison in the Tower of London for pretty much the rest of his life, which wasn't very long. It was about another 11 years or so, but he was in prison for about 8 of those and spent the last of his remaining years in France, where he died. But Edward, after capturing Balliol, of course sent his troops around Scotland to take over the towns, the cities, etc. But he had one last stop before heading back to England, and that last stop was at a place called Scone. Scone Palace, that's where the kings and queens of Scotland were crowned. And this is where Scotland's throne was, the Stone of Destiny, or the Stone of Scone. So Edward goes into Scone Palace and removes the Stone of Destiny from its place at Scone and takes it down to England. The significance of this is that this is, of course, Scotland's coronation throne, and Edward had it specifically placed so the coronation throne of England was redesigned to hold the Stone of Destiny, and that's still I believe still the same throne that they use today. So the stone was placed underneath, on a shelf underneath the English coronation throne. Now, to me, this is just a personal opinion, to me as a proud Scot, this indicates that that Scotland's throne is regarded as underneath the English throne, that England rules over Scotland, sort of thing. There's a bit of politics in there, I suppose, but that's just my opinion on it. Everyone has different opinions, but that's the way that I look at it. So the Stone of Destiny was taken, and this is in the year 1296. Now, the Stone of Destiny is worthy of its own entire episode, so I don't really want to tell you what happens to the Stone of Destiny over the course of the next, 700 years or so, because it's got a great history to it itself. So we will focus more on the actual Stone of Destiny itself on a future episode. So Balliol's now removed. Edward is now back in England with the Scottish throne. Scotland is thrown into absolute turmoil. Edward's troops slowly taking over and all that sort of thing. But 1296 into the year 1297, this is where a sort of an underground group of soldiers and ordinary folk, really, that's where they start to rise up from the ashes of the towns that are being burned down around them, and guerrilla warfare and that sort of thing. And this is where William Wallace will come into the story. However, I want an entire episode just based on William Wallace, so I'm going to, at this moment in time, leave it there. So just to kind of take a little bit of extra time in this podcast, I mean, I would expect that over the course of time, the podcast will be a little bit better structured, of course a little bit better recorded, and maybe a little bit better presented. So I'm kind of trying to stick to 20-25 minutes at this moment in time, so I've still got a little bit of time left. So what I would just like to do here is just bring attention to, sort of today in Scottish history. I'm recording this podcast on Saturday the 21st of December in 2019, and that marks the anniversary of the Lockerbie bombing. This was an incident in 1988, so the 21st of December 1988, Pan Am Flight 103 from Frankfurt to Detroit via London and New York was destroyed by a bomb placed on board, killing on board all 243 passengers and 16 crew. Large sections of the aircraft crashed into a residential street in Lockerbie, which is down on the sort of southwest of Scotland, and it also killed 11 people on the ground. To this day, it is still the deadliest terror attack in the history of the United Kingdom, with a total of 270 dead. So of course I would just like to sort of bring the attention to that. If you would like to learn more, of course there's a lot more information available online. So I think that's where today's episode is going to finish. Next episode, of course, I'm going to start focusing on William Wallace, a true Scottish hero, a true Scottish patriot. So I think that's going to be quite a big podcast. Whether it will be in 2 parts or whether it will be a much longer episode, that still remains to be seen. But for just now, I'd like to again thank anyone that's listening. You can follow us now on Facebook, facebook.com/Scott History Pod. That's Scott, SCOT, History, and Pod, POD. You've also got Twitter, at Scott History Pod. Again, bit of a theme going on here. And of course, we have an email address. That's Scott History Pod, once again, at gmail.com. So please feel free to message, and again, please share this podcast around so that as many people can hear it as possible. So once again, thank you very much. I've been Owen Innes, and I'll see you on the next episode.